we're going to have a look at the support system in animals. So like you can see in front of me, I've got a few skulls that we're going to look at and study and see if I can help you to understand this work better. So let's jump away and start with the skeleton. Right, so we're going to do the human skeleton. And when we look at the human skeleton, we can see that we can divide the skeleton into two main sections. We've got the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So there's two parts of the skeleton, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So what is meant by the axial skeleton? The axial skeleton consists out of three different parts. We've got the skull, and that's very important. We're going to look at that closely because that is part of our grade 12 work. Then the vertebral column and the rib cage. So there's three different parts, the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. So in this picture, this diagram, you can see the part that is colored in red is our axial skeleton. Right, let's start with the skull. So the skull consists out of two different groups of bones. We've got the bones that is part of the cranium and then the facial bones. Now there's different facial bones which we'll study just now. But first I want to look at this part, the cranium part, this part that is colored gray. Now first of all, we see that the cranium encloses the brain and it protects it. Remember that the brain is a very soft organ, so it needs protection. And then the cranium of apes is smaller than that of humans. So let's quickly look at the two models that I've got in front of me. So on the one side, I've got a human skull, and on the other side, I don't have a chimpanzee or an African ape, but I've got a baboon skull. Yeah. So the cranium, which is this part, which I can actually open up, that is the part that protects the brain. Now, if we look at the size of the cranium, we can see that if the cranium is large, let me quickly turn it around so that you can see the inside. We say that this organism, which is now the human, is more intelligent than an organism like, for instance, if we look now at the baboon's cranium, here at the back, we can see that it is smaller. Now, first of all, grade 10s, please make sure that you understand the difference between it. We cannot say that the skull is smaller or larger, because if you think of a chimpanzee is a lot bigger than a human. So its skull will be bigger than that of a human. We can't really compare now a baboon with that. And then a lot of times the learner wants to actually say that the cranium is larger. So if a cranium, that of a human, that is the largest part if we compare that with, for instance, a chimpanzee, which means that humans are more intelligent than that of a chimpanzee. So the cranium, the part that protects the brain. The next part in the skull, and the next important part of the skull, is this large opening that we see here at the back of the skull. Now this opening is called the foramen magnum. The function of this opening is where the spinal cord passes through. So your spinal cord enters into this hole, into the skull to the brain. Now once again, if we compare humans and animals like, for instance, the chimpanzee, or then in this case this afternoon with the baboon, we will see that the human foramen is more forward in position. And now the question is why? Why is it more forward? And we see that the answer lies in the fact that humans walk on two legs. What we call that is bipedalism. So for you to walk on two legs, your foramen must be more in a forward position. If we look at the African ape, now you might not know what is in the African ape. Examples of that is now, for instance, the chimpanzee or the gorilla is part of the African ape. And we can see that the foramen is more backwards in position. Once again, the question is why? And we see that apes in general use 4 limbs for locomotion. So what is the biological terminology for that? We call that quadrupedal. So humans are bipedal, and apes that walk on 4 limbs, they are quadrupedal. The picture here, once again, you can see that is the human skull. We can see that it is in a more forward position, where the African ape is more in a backward position. Now, if I go back to my models, we want to see if that is actually true. So if I turn this skull around, we can see here in the back, that is where the spinal cord enters into the skull, and we can see that it is to a more forward position. The reason why is when I keep this spoon in an up straight position, you can see that the skull will rest on the spinal cord, and that allows an organism, the human, to walk on 2 legs, meaning that they are bipedalism. If I look at the skull of the baboon and I turn it around, then we can see that the foramen is more to a backward position. Let me quickly do a comparison between that. So you can see this one is more forward, it's more to the jawline, where in this case, this one is more to the back of the skull. You can see there's a difference in the two. And that is very, very important, that you understand the difference between this position of the foramen, because it's part of your grade 12 work that you need to understand. Right. If we go on, there's more differences in the skull. So if we compare the human skull, we can see that the upper jaw, it's first of all, it is fused to the skull. So there's the upper jaw, and that will be fused with the skull, and the lower jaw will articulate at the base of the skull. The jaw of humans are smaller than that of apes. If we compare the palate of the two, we see that the humans have a rounded palate, where, for instance, a chimpanzee or then the baboon, it's got a rectangular shape. So round in comparison with rectangular. The upper and the lower jaw carry teeth in humans, and humans have smaller teeth than apes. Right, so we're back to my model again. If I turn it around and we first look at the human skull, we say that the upper jaw, this part, is fused to the skull. It cannot articulate, it cannot move. But our lower jaw, our maxilla, this part can move, it can articulate. And if I look at the back, I can see that this part, the jaw is more round. If I compare, once again, grade 10s, remember this is not an African ape that I've got here. I've got a baboon, but at least we can compare the shape of the two. And then we can see that the human skull that I have here in this hand with a blue spoon is more round, where if I compare it with that of the baboon, you can see that the baboon's got a more rectangular shape. Now, if I compare the teeth of the two, we can see that the teeth of apes are much larger. They've got very long canines. And then there's also an opening there where the two teeth needs to meet. Let me just quickly turn it to this side that you can see the side view. And that's just an area to allow that the bottom long canine can pass through. So your apes will have larger teeth, where if I compare it to that of humans, we see that human teeth are smaller, and we do not, I colored in our canine here, is smaller than that of an ape. So what is the function of the different teeth that you see here? So let's quickly see the function. First of all, we've got the incisors. That's the front teeth. So that's that teeth that you see here. It's half of a jaw teeth. And your incisors is there to bite and cut off food. So if you bite an apple, you will use your incisors. Then our canines, the function for that is to hold food in place and to tear it off. Now I want to quickly remind you, please grade 10s, when you talk about the canines, do not write down K9 using the letter K and then 9. It is marked incorrectly. You must write the whole word when you talk about the canines. Then we've got the premolars, which is there for chewing and gritting food, and the molars. So let's quickly look at the model again so that we can identify. Right in front, we've got our incisors. That's, if I look from the center, you've got two big ones and the two smaller ones. And that is for cutting. Then the one that I've colored in green, that is our canine, which is there to hold food. And then we move to our molars, our premolars, and then our molars there right at the back. That is there for chewing and grinding food. Right. I want to quickly move back to the skull and just for a moment look what we've discussed, because the skull is really very important for grade 12 work. So if you compare the skull, first of all, we've got the area that is there to protect the brain. Remember, in humans, it is bigger than that of the African ape. Then we've got the shape of the jaw, which is more round, where in the apes it's more rectangular. Then it's the position of the foramen. In the ape, it is more to the back, meaning to the back of the head, and in humans, it is more forward. You have to use the words more forward in position. So that's the difference between the major differences between the skull of humans and then the skull of apes. Right, let's move to the vertebra. If we look at the vertebral column, we see that the vertebral column of humans consists out of 31 bones. So if you count all of them, there will be 31 of them. The two important ones is the first one, which is the first cervical vertebra, and that articulates with the skull. So it's known as the atlas, that's the one colored here in red, and that allows the skull to make a nodding, a yes and a no movement possible. So it allows this skull to move up and down. It's your atlas. You can see the articulate areas here where the skull articulates on the vertebra. Then the second cervical vertebra is called the axis, and the axis function is for rotation. So it allows you to look from the side to side. So it helps the skull to rotate from the left to the right. So that's the two very important vertebrae that you need to know. Now, once again, a grade 12 fact that you need to understand, and that is the shape of the vertebral column. In humans, because we are bipedal, we walk on two legs, our vertebral column has got this S shape. And the reason why is for shock absorption and flexibility. I want to focus here on the picture again. Remember that opening that you've got here, the foramen magnum. You can see that the skull rests on this vertebral column, and then we've got this S shape which allows us then for balance so that we can be bipedal. If we look at the vertebral column of an ape, which is quadrupedal, they walk on four legs most of the time, we can see that it's got an S shape. The skull doesn't rest on this vertebral column the same as in humans. What is the function of our vertebral column? We see that there's three. First of all, it supports the skull. Then it surrounds and protects the spinal cord. Remember, your spinal cord is just as important as your brain. So it needs to be protected the same way as the brain. And then it serves as an attachment for the ribs, the back muscle, the pectoral, and the pelvic girdle. This picture, once again, you can see, remember, there's 33 bones. We've got the part that is part of our neck. Then we've got our thorax and our lumbar. And then right there at the bottom, there's the bones that are fused all together. Right, the rib cage. If we look at the rib cage, we've got 12 thoracic vertebrae and then 12 pairs of ribs. So each pair of ribs will be connected to the thoracic vertebra. And then right in the middle, we've got the sternum. The sternum is a very, very hard bone, one of the hardest bones in the body. And we can understand that because right behind that is your heart. So it needs to protect your heart. And besides the heart that is protected by the sternum, our ribs protect our lungs as well. The rib cage also plays a role in breathing, as the movement of the rib cage increase and decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity. Now, this fact is once again very important for grade 11 work when you focus on breathing. So for us to be able to breathe, this rib cage must move up and down. Remember that there is absolutely no muscles inside your lungs. You use your diaphragm and then the muscles that is surrounded your rib cage. you use those muscles for breathing and not muscles that is situated inside our lungs. There's no muscles like that. So the rib cage is very important for breathing as well. Right, then we are there by our appendicular skeleton. Once again, it's colored in red, and we can divide it into two griddles. We've got the pectoral griddle, which is the top part and the upper limbs, and then the pelvic griddle and the lower limbs. Now, out of these two, the pelvic griddle is once again very important to focus on, because it plays a role again in the way that we walk. So if you bipedal, there will be the structure of the pelvic griddle will look different from a quadrupedal organism. But let's quickly focus on the pectoral griddle. The pectoral griddle consists out of the scapula, that's that part right there at the back, and then the clavicles, which is the top part. The clavicles also plays a role in protection of the lungs. The top part of the lungs are protected by this clavicle bones that you see here. Right, now the upper limbs. Let's quickly see if we can identify the different kinds of bones. The first bone is the humerus, and that's the long bone. That's the bone that is connected to your scapula. And then we've got the largest bone of the forearm, and that's the ulna. Now the ulna is that bone that is connected to your pinky, your small little finger right there is your ulna. Then your radius, the radius is the bone that is connected to your thumb. Now in Afrikaans you get the word ry if you drive, and that's the way that I remember that R, is if you want to get a lift, you put out your thumb and hope you get a lift, and that's the way that I remember the radius is the one that I use if I want to pick up a lift somewhere. And then we've got the bones that is part of your wrist, your carpals, and you can see that's the small little bones there that is form part of your wrist. And then the hand bones, which is your metacarpals. So remember, the carpals is your wrist, the meta is in the middle, and that is part of your palm, the bones that you've got in your palm. So there will be 5 of them because you've got 5 fingers, so there will be 5 metacarpal bones. And then last, your phalanges, which is your finger bones. Remember that each finger have 3 phalanges, except your thumb, which only got 2. So if we count the number of phalanges bones, you will see that there's 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14. You've got 14 phalanges because your thumb only has 2 bones. Then we move to the pelvic griddle. Now the pelvic griddle, remember it's part of grade 12 work, so we must make sure we understand it nicely. There is 2 hip bones, and the hip bones are made out of 3 bones that are fused. We've got the ilium, which is this one that's more yellowish in color. Then we've got the ischium, which is this purple one. And then we've got your pubis bone, which is the green one. All these bones are fused together, and they are attached right at the back to your sacrum. Remember, the sacrum is part of the vertebral column, and it consists out of bones that are fused together. So that is our pelvic girdle. Very important. It protects a lot of major organs that are situated here. And it helps us with balancing. So if we make a comparison between the human pelvic girdle and that of apes, we can see that the human pelvic girdle is shorter and wider. If I look there at the apes, I can see that it is longer and narrower. Now the question again is why? Why this difference between these two organisms? And then we remember it's all about the way that we walk. If you bipedal, you walk on two legs, you need your pelvic girdle to be very strong and stable, because a lot of weight is resting on this part of the body, and that's why it is shorter and wider. Grade 10s, remember, you must learn these words. Sometimes you want to use different words, but in grade 12 they will only mark these two words. So the human pelvic girdle is shorter and wider. And then if we look at apes, we see that it's longer and narrower, because it doesn't need to have that lot of weight resting on this part of the body, because it's quadrupedal, it walks on 4 legs. The weight is more spread out. If we look at the lower limbs, then we can see that the different parts there is then once again your this long, very, very long, the longest bone in the body, the femur. And then we've got this kneecap, the patella. And then we've got exactly the same as the arm. The lower part of the bone or the leg consists out of 2 bones. We've got your fibula and your tarsals. Your tibia, sorry, it's your tibia and your fibula. The tibia is if you kick somebody, that's that part that you kick. And then the fibula is the bone right there at the back that is connected to the heel bone. And then we've got exactly the same as in the hands. We've got the little small bones, the tarsals, then the metatarsals, and then the phalanges, which is the toe bones. Now I've got an example of a foot here. So if we compare the foot and we look at the different parts, we can see that the tarsals is these little bones that you see here. It's a bit different than the hand bones, because your heel bone is larger than the other bones, but that's the little small bones that you see here. Let me quickly turn it around so that you can see it nicely on the camera. And then we've got the metatarsals, which is in the middle. So that is your foot bones, the part that is part of your foot. And once again, there will be 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got the phalanges, which is the toe bones. And this one, exactly the same as the hand. We've only got 2 bones for the big toe. And then we've got 3 little bones for the other 4 toes. Even your small little toe consists out of 3 bones. 1, 2, 3. 3 little small bones there. So if we count the number of bones again, you will see that there's 14 of them. 3 for each toe, except for your big toe that only consists out of 2 bones. And then remember that the metatarsals is the middle bones, that is part of the foot, and then the tarsals is that part that makes the wrist of the foot, and the heel bone is the biggest bone in the foot. Right, so that's our foot bones. Right, let's quickly see what is the function of our skeleton. There's 6 major functions. It is there for support, movement, protection, minerals storage, hearing, and then the production of blood cells. If you get a question, name 2 functions of the skeleton, never ever just write a word. Always write a sentence. We can never say the function of the skeleton is support, because support of what? Protection of what? You must be more specific when you give a function. So always write a sentence. So let's quickly see what is the 6 different functions of the skeleton. First of all, the support. What is meant by that? Bones will support and give shape to the body and attach muscles and soft organs. So if we think of, you won't be able to move if you do not have these bones that will support and give shape to the body. Then we move to the movement. It plays a role in movement together with the muscles and the joints. We will be able to move, and then it protects. Think of the cranium that protects the soft organs like the brain, and the sternum we mentioned that protects the heart, and the rib cage that protects the lungs. So it plays a role in protection. And then we've got the minerals storage, very important. A lot of minerals are stored inside the bone tissues. Minerals like calcium and phosphorus that is stored inside our bones. That's why we need to drink a lot of calcium, so that these minerals will be stored inside our bones. Then hearing, the smallest bones in our body. There's 3 little small bones which we call the ossicles, and that allows us to hear because it transmits sound waves that comes in the form of sound right into your internal ear, and then it vibrates and it makes hearing possible. So once again, in grade 12, we're going to focus on function 5. We're going to see how the ear works, and then you're going to learn about these little small bones that is inside our ear. And then last of all, a very interesting fact is that our bones plays a very important role in the production of blood cells, whether it's the white blood cells that is there to help us fight infections, or the red blood cells that helps us to transport oxygen. All these cells are produced inside the bone marrow, inside these tall bones of our body. Right, grade 10s. Let's quickly recap and see if you can identify the different parts of the bone. And after we've identified, we're going to look at a few questions, which is based on your type of matric questions that you can get into a question or in an exam paper. Exams is almost here, so we must make sure that we understand the work nicely. So let's see if you can identify the different parts of the bones. Remember, if it's a question 1.2, which is biological terminology, you must be able to write the biological terminology or the biological words of the bones. So let's see, let's start. Right there at the top, the first bone that we've got here, quickly see if you can remember that, and that is of course our skull. Remember that the skull consists out of different bones, of which the cranium is the most important one for us to remember, because that is part of our grade 12 work. And if the cranium is large, it forms part of the, it's a more intelligent organism. And if the cranium is smaller, it will be there by the African apes. The next part is this section here. You can see we can divide it in this part, and then that part, and right there at the bottom. So that is our vertebra, and we can divide the vertebra into 3 sections. The first one is the cervical, and the cervical vertebra, that's your neck. Then your thoracic, which is part of your thorax, and your lumbar is the largest vertebra, and that is the part that needs to support your body. Remember again, you can see that the skull rests on the vertebra because we as humans are bipedal, and therefore our foramen magnum, the opening right there at the back, is more forward in position in comparison with that of apes. Remember, we don't say more central. That's not what we say. We say it's more forward, because more central means right in the middle of the skull, and that's not true. Then we've got these 3 bones here at the bottom, which is part of our pelvic girdle, and there we've got our ilium, and we've got there the bone which is part of our vertebra, that is our sacrum, and the small little bone is our coccyx, which is that part of in organisms that have long tails, their coccyx is longer than ours, but we don't have tails. Right, then we move to the labels on this side. First of all, that bone that you see here, who can remember what the name of this bone is? It protects the lungs as well, and that is our clavicle. With the clavicle, we've got the bone right there at the back, and it serves as an attachment area where all the muscles of this appendicular part of the skull can attach, and that is our scapula. Then this very important bone that protects the heart, who can remember that one, which is the hardest bone in the body, and that is the sternum. And then the ribs, there's 12 pairs of that protects our lungs and our heart. Then we can divide the arm into 3 major bones. The longest one, which is connected to the scapula and the clavicle, there's this bone here, and that is your humerus. And then there's 2 bones, the radius and the ulna. We need to see which is which. To identify which is the radius and which is the ulna, we try to find the thumb, and there's the thumb. And if we see the thumb, we remember that we want to drive, we want to ry in Afrikaans, and that's the bone that you see here, and that's the radius. That is the bone that is connected to the thumb. And then the one that is connected to your small finger is the ulna. Then we can divide the hand just as the foot in different parts. the part that is part of your wrist is your carpals, and then the hand bones, 5 of them, metacarpals, and then the finger bones is the phalanges. The bottom part, the longest bone in our body, is the femur. Then our kneecap is our patella. Remember, if it's question 1.2 biological terminology, we can't say kneecap, we must write down patella. And then once again, exactly as the arm or the upper limb, we've got 2 different bones we need to identify. And the first one is the tibia, the one right in front. The one at the back is the fibula. And then you see here that big bone that you see here that I showed you with a model, that is our heel bone. And then we can divide the foot the same as the hand into different parts. The tarsals, which is part of the joint, then the metatarsal, the foot bone, and then the phalanges, which is your toe bones. Right, let's see if we can do a few questions this afternoon and see how they might ask questions that involve our skeleton. Right, the first question. We've got a picture, a diagram A and B, and it is the ventral, the bottom view, and then we see that they show 2 openings. Now, luckily they already labeled it, and they say that it's the foramen magnum, so that's the opening. And then you remember the foramen is that part where the spinal cord enters into the skull, and we must identify between quadrupedal and bipedal organisms. In bipedal organism, this foramen will be more to the front, and there's the front view, where quadrupedal, this foramen will be more to the back. So by looking at the 2 openings, we already know that organism A will be quadrupedal and organism B will be bipedal. If we look at the shape of the palate, we see that this one is more round, where in the African apes it's more rectangular. We can also see that they've got larger teeth in comparison with humans, where the teeth are smaller. This large teeth that you see here is the canines. And remember, you're not allowed to write canines, you must write the word, you must spell it correctly. So, which diagram represents the skull of a bipedal organism, an organism that walks on 2 legs? And then we have to look at the position of the foramen. We say that it's more to the front, so it must be organism B, that is bipedal. Now they ask, give one visible. Grade 10s, remember, if they say visible, you have to see it on the diagram. A lot of times there might be more reasons, but it's not necessarily visible for you to see. So in this case, we can see that the foramen is more forward in comparison with organism A. And that's why we said that organism B is the bipedal organism. That's our visible reason. The foramen is in a more forward position, not more central, more forward position. The next question, they say tabulate 2 visible, once again, highlight that word if you see a word like this, visible, because you have to see it on the diagram between the upper jaw of diagram A and diagram B that is represented traits in human development over time. Right, so it's a tabulate, so you have to draw a table. If I ask you to tabulate, you always write a heading and you always draw a little block around your answer. And then 2 visible reasons. So let's see, what can we see there that tells us that there's more development that took place in the one organism. And then we can see here, if I compare the two, I can see that here, like I've already mentioned, that there's large canines, where in these ones there's no canines, smaller canines. So that means this organism needs to use its jaw to tear and catch animals and food and tear it apart, where you don't have to do it. You've got a knife and fork. You can cut your food, you can cook your food. So we don't have to have big teeth to chew our food. Then the jawline, you can see it's more rectangular, where this one is more curved shape. And then protruding jaw, the jaw is more forward, where in humans there's less protrusion taking place. So if I give you a question like that, to tabulate the difference, you have to draw a table. You get a free mark just for doing that. Remember to write your heading and then the difference. And remember, when you answer a question like that, if I talk here about canines, and you see it's not a K and then a 9, it's the word, then whatever I mention this side, I must mention on the other side as well. So I'm talking about canines here. What about canines on that side? I talk here about the shape. It's U shape. And then how is the shape on the other side? It's more round. Or with this afternoon we said that it's more rectangular. Now what's the shape on that side? It's more gentle. And then what about protruding jaws? It's more protrude, where in humans it is less. Now they say, explain the significance of the shape of the spine that is associated with the skull in diagram B. So what about this skull's vertebra? How will the shape be? Now once again, remember, the foramen is more in a forward position. So this organism is bipedal. So that means its spine must be more in an S shape to absorb more shock and to be more flexible. So we've got an S-shaped spine, and the reason why is for flexibility and then shock absorption. The next question is a comparison between different organisms. So here we've got 3 different organisms, organism A, B, and C. And let's quickly just unpack the picture and see if you can identify, before we answer the questions, if we can identify which organism will do what. So if we just look at the pelvic structure, we see that A and B, the pelvic is short and wide, where C is more narrow and long. So by just looking at the pelvic structure, we can say that organism A and B will walk on 2 legs. Why? Because the pelvic is short and wide. so it's bipedal, where organism C will most probably be quadrupedal. And once again, why do we say that? Because the pelvic structure is long and narrow. Now we compare the skulls, and we look, if we want to see if the organism is bipedal, we go and look at the position of the foramen. And we see that this organism X, the foramen is more to a forward position, as well as organism Z. Once again, we can see the foramen is more to a forward position. Where organism Y, we can see that that opening is more to the back. So that tells me that organism X and organism Z will most probably be bipedal, and organism Y will be quadrupedal. We can also look at the shape of the teeth, which got nothing to do with the way that they walk, but we can look at development, and we see that these two organisms, organism X and Z, their jawline is more round and their teeth is more or less the same size. So there's more development that took place, where in organism Y, we've got a more rectangular shape with large canines. So that tells me that this organism most probably still needs to kill its food, and it can't cook the same as in humans, where we can cook our food. So let's quickly look at the question. Write down the letters of the diagram that represent the skull of bipedal organisms. So which two will be bipedal? And we've said that it's X and Z. And quadrupedal, by looking at the pelvic structure, that will be then C. Now they ask us to give reasons for question 2.1b. Why did we say that? And we said that the pelvic is long and narrow. And then the last question, describe one other structural difference between a bipedal and a quadrupedal organism. So what other difference, not the ones that we've seen here, meaning the position of the foramen or the pelvic structure, what other difference can be there? And then you remember about the shape of the spine, that for your bipedal organisms, the spine needs to have an S shape so that it can absorb shock. And your quadrupedal organisms, they need to have a C shape because they don't need to absorb the shock. Right, great, Tens. It was a busy afternoon. I hope that you've learned a lot. Good luck for the rest of the year. Good luck for the exams. Study hard. It's almost your year in grade 11. So good luck and good afternoon to everyone.